See colleagues, greetings to you and thank you for the opportunity to engage with you on matters of water history, which have occupied my life for, well, the better part of, say, 24 years now. But it's still putting a spark in my thinking. And I'd like to today talk to you about when things fall apart, the 2017-2018 sewage spills in the Vaal River catchment and its aftermath. So I've written much on this already, so I've made a number of scattering notes from my various papers I've written on this and that I have done in collaboration with Curiwat, the research group that we do transdisciplinary research on. Now, the introduction is the question or the quest to look deeper. In March 2023, Emfuleni Local Municipality and two Gauteng metros, Tshwane and Johannesburg, were singled out by South Africa's Auditor General as the poorest performers in terms of the Municipal Financial Management Act in Gauteng, South Africa's most economically active province. So Gauteng's Joburg and Tshwane are big spaces, but Emfuleni, where does it fit in? And when you look closer at the report, you see that the Auditor General was making an assessment for the period 2021. So it is the years in which South Africa's countrywide drought basically came to an end and things weren't going well. They were still fairly fallen apart. And it should be seen as a product of a long-term development trend that preceded 2021. So the direct bearing that it has for the purposes of this discussion is that the drought conditions in South Africa between 2014-2020 potentially had a grave impact on the operations and the finances of local authorities in many parts of South Africa. It was a typical long durée event manifesting in a state of things falling apart. Is there more to this argument? Yes, I would say, but only if we look somewhat deeper. And I intend to explore with you this area, and you are free to question me upon what I'd thought about and contemplated. 2018 was, in many respects, a year of things falling apart. It was 60 years after Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, that was published in 1958, provided information on the collapses of what happened when a traditional Nigerian society was faced with colonialism. And he bereaved that fact. And similar events started playing themselves off in South Africa in the 2010s. Internationally, falling apart also gained some traction with Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, a bestseller. Things Fall Apart also played a prominent role, and he even had some good advice on how to deal with realities when things fall apart. In South Africa, since 2015, there had been intense decolonization debates going on at South Africa's universities. So decolonization was part of this spin. And at the government level, in February 2018, Jacob Zuma was recalled by the ANC as the president of South Africa, and his successor was Cyril Ramaphosa. On the Vaal River barrage, stream of water south of Gauteng, there was also another severe fish kill on the Vaal River barrage. It's a 64-kilometer stretch of the Vaal River, below the Vaal Dam, and it's part of the very important integrated Vaal River system. There was also a countrywide drought that culminated with Cape Town's own day zero. It was a traumatic event that started in 2015 and culminated in 2018 with local residents basically confined to a water consumption of 50 liters per capita per day. So there was this meta-consciousness of things falling apart in South Africa. Fortunately, by now, I think we in South Africa have come to live with the idea of things falling apart, because we're surviving and we're thriving actually in the time of load shedding and water shortages and what have you, and floods and the rest. But in Emfuleni municipalities, wastewater treatment systems, things were falling apart, and that was no coincidence at all. Now, let me just show you the Vaal River system, the integrated Vaal River system. That is the portion of South Africa, you can say Central South Africa, that the integrated Vaal River system is responsible for. It starts up in Lesotho, in the Lesotho Highlands, and then the Highlands water finishes up in the Vaal Dam, and then you find the Vaal River barrage passing through here. This is the upper Vaal River barrage, Vaal River region. This is the middle Vaal River, and this is the lower Vaal River. Up to the 1990s, this was probably one of the most complex water transfer systems in the world. And many people from overseas came to South Africa to see how a water-stressed country was getting along in terms of securing water supply. And just for a little add-in, this is the Crocodile catchment and the Mokolo catchment. They feed into the Limpopo, which finishes up in Mozambique. So the integrated Vaal River system is very comprehensive, and it's very important to many consumers. But the upper Vaal River storage facilities are also extremely important. Here you see in 2019, February 2019, the Mohale Dam in Lesotho was 18.4% of capacity. The Katsu Dam was 36% of capacity, and the Vaal Dam was 71% of capacity. That was the direct line feed into the integrated Vaal River system. The Sterkfontein Dam, which was not used before 2020, had a capacity of 93%. So by 2020, the end of 2020, we were basically in the 20% level of Vaal Dam. So if the rains did not come, we were in for a lot of trouble. And this system extends down to Bloemhof, the Bloemhof Dam. So it's a very comprehensive dam storage system operated by the Department of Water and Sanitation, and it has to work like a clockwork orange. Otherwise, you have undersupplies and you have floods, as was recently the case. But also the Vaal River and the Vaal River barrage specifically has a lot of residents, domestic residents on the banks of the river. And also the river is used in this section for tourism and leisure purposes. And it attracts a lot of visitors, brings in tourist money for a previously highly industrialized region of South Africa. Now, one of the prime problems that we have in the Vaal River barrage system, there's the Vaal Dam, is wastewater treatment works. Now, can you imagine keeping this stretch of river in a pristine state for downstream consumers if you have leaking wastewater treatment works? And that is one of the major critical issues that we have, but it's managed extremely well and in a very authoritative way by the Department of Water and Sanitation, as well as Rand Water. Now, the Vaal barrage is the heart to a significant extent of what used to be the former Vaal Triangle. The Vaal Barrage came into existence in 1923. The Rand Water Board was responsible for its construction. It wanted to supply water supplies to the Witwatersrand, at the time the fastest growing gold fields in the world. As of the 1950s, exponential growth took place, and the barrage was influenced by that, because since the late 1930s, a comprehensive system of the water, energy, food nexus started taking shape, because the region had become a prime region for water supplies, for example, to the Witwatersrand, increasingly also energy with power stations, and also Sasol's operations, and also food downstream at the Vaal scheme. They produced masses of food, and it's a whole WEF nexus system that came into operation. The major leading cities of the time was Vereeniging, 1892, Vanderbijlpark started in 1952, and Sasolburg started in 1950. So the industrial growth was rapid. Urbanization and population growth was at the order of the day in all these urban areas that you see here, that's mentioned here. By the 1990s, the Vaal Triangle development was similar to that of the UK's Sheffield and Germany's Ruhrgebiet in the 19th century. Between the 1970s and 1990, the area was a high growth space in an era of the border war, where arms production was at the order of the day, and the strategic industries of ISCOR and related activities of other industries, and the strategic energy supplies of Sasol and Eskom made it possible for South Africa, which lived under a state of siege as a result of international restrictions, and also the struggle gaining the upper hand in terms of publicity and support for the ANC. And so the region started diminishing in supply, its status after the 1990s. By 1994, we had the transition to a new post-apartheid democracy in South Africa. It was also the onset of an intense post-industrialization process. ISCOR, for example, was sold to ArcelorMittal, an Indian company, in the period 1995 to 1996. As a parastatal, ISCOR up to 1990 had a population of employees between 45 and 50,000 people. By 2015, ArcelorMittal only had 4,500 employees. So you can imagine what happened in terms of job opportunities in the region. Also, Sasol 1 in Sasolburg made some transitions thanks to the Mbeki era's African Renaissance strategy between 2005-2007. Sasolburg operations started working on Mozambican gas instead of mining coal, because the coal supplies had started running down, and they could not access more profitable coal supplies in the region of operations. Also, there was increasing unemployment at the same time. The urban population, however, did not decrease. In fact, it became rampant. By the 2020s, Emfuleni's population of an estimated 850,000 residents had 65% of the economically active population unemployed. The South African average rate of unemployment at the time was 43%. So we had a constant in-migration process. These people came from the country's rural areas as well as neighboring Lesotho and possibly also Eswatini and also Zimbabwe. By the 2000s, the greater Sebokeng region became a sleeping city for the emerging megalopolis or megacity of Johannesburg, Midrand and Tshwane, which is estimated now to have a population in the vicinity between of Gauteng, that specific vicinity between 13 and 17 million people. This growth trend has been persistent since the early 2000s. So water and wastewater infrastructure in southern Gauteng since the early 2000s, which is our actual focus, features the wastewater treatment works of Emfuleni, of Leuco, Rietspruit, and Sebokeng. They are all situated in the former African townships of the former Vaal Triangle. So these people have to bear the brunt of the dirt flowing down in the streams and in the gutters when the wastewater treatment works do not work. So local potable water supplies are quite kosher because Rand Water has been providing the whole Vaal Triangle with water since the 1930s. So the water supplies are good. Also, we find that significant changes followed in the 2000s. In 2000, new local, district, and metropolitan municipal systems came into effect. This affected the infrastructure systems. They were destabilized because the technical knowledge that had been built up over a period of decades at wastewater treatment works, for example, were in the process of out-migration from the local infrastructure systems because of the changing municipal system, where there was no longer space for people of a different color and a different race. So what happened was, at the same time as the system started deteriorating, we find that the new democratic era primarily demanded of government to provide free water and sanitation services to its people. And government had an honest and sincere objective to provide in this, but it was problematic because it had financial implications. Now, if you look at the roots of the water protests, and there were many in the 1990s already, and there was a very strong activist front in this respect, its roots lay in the non-payment protests of the 1980s, when the previous government introduced a fake constitution and regional services councils, but also abject poverty in many parts of the country got people moving behind non-payment for services. By the 1990s and the early 2000s, non-payment protests against metering and water were at the forefront in many of the rural municipalities, and then it intensely washed over to the urban areas of South Africa. In Emfuleni in the early 2000s, there emerged a vulnerable local authority where poverty and a post-industrial local development phase persisted. They simply could not work themselves out of this difficult predicament they experienced. By 2008, we find the first planning for an integrated Sebokeng district wastewater scheme. Now, this scheme was a bit of a pipe dream, but it held in lots of promise, but it also required a commitment on the side of several local authorities in the system. Now, how did the things start falling apart when we look at it in a broader perspective? The drought in the upper Vaal became very manifest in the period 2015-2018. One of the first examples of what was happening falling apart was Denisville's wastewater treatment works. Now, Denisville is a town on the banks of the Vaal Dam, and it had severe leaking sewage system problems, but it did not affect Rand Water's operation because they had a straw extraction system in the central part of the dam at some distance from the local Denisville spills. Also, there was an infrastructure crisis of the day. In 2017, in the whole of South Africa, only 7% of South Africa's 824 municipality wastewater treatment works were operational. So we are sitting here, we see an endemic problem presenting itself. The condition of Emfuleni's wastewater treatment works collapsing in 2017 and 2018. Sorry, we're responsible for.
Sorry,
Yes?
can I ask you to wrap up about 5 minutes?
Okay, so severe fish kills followed, and there was a major outcry, and the NGOs came to the fore. And in the process, Emfuleni was taken to the High Court, Gauteng High Court. They could not feature, they were told to take care of the system. But also in September 2018, the Human Rights Commission moved in, and the new Ramaphosa presidency had a listening ear for the residents of Emfuleni, and they managed to convince government to step in. Then towards the end of 2018, the South African National Defence Force stepped in to take over the infrastructure. But what had happened earlier was in 2017 already, what appears to be the construction mafia of KwaZulu-Natal had also penetrated Emfuleni, and they were demanding for jobs for local residents, and this really put the municipality in a fix. So the Defence Force also had to protect the infrastructure, the wastewater treatment works, and the pump systems of the city. At Sebokeng hostels, we've had streams of wastewater standing for weeks on end outside the hostels where families were resident. Even in the suburb of Peacehaven in Vereeniging, raw sewage started flowing from the sidewalks of the streets downstream towards the Vaal River barrage. So South Africa had a national election in 2019. Ramaphosa was elected once again. Lindiwe Sisulu was his Minister of Water and Sanitation. And in 2021, the new minister, Senzo Mchunu, came into the seat, and he started taking charge because he was a very dedicated minister, and he started introducing a Section 63 intervention on the Vaal River barrage. Now, it implied changes to the National Water Services Act, which allowed the National Department to take charge of wastewater treatment systems of municipalities and upgrade them and help finance them and put them into a working order. But also the department went much further. They introduced a water resources infrastructure agency that enables them now to get funding on the open market to finance these operations. And it's a costly operation in the case of Emfuleni, where 4.75 billion rand has been earmarked for upgrading the wastewater treatment works of the Sebokeng district wastewater treatment system. Right. So
can I ask you just to conclude? Thanks.
Okay, sorry. I'm almost finished. I asked ChatGPT to provide me some information about the problems of Emfuleni's wastewater treatment works. dilapidated infrastructure, overflowing systems, inadequate funding, poor management, legal challenges. Then I asked Chat, those observations of Chat within the space of approximately 30 seconds were on the mark. And then I asked Chat, what would happen if we think about climate change and the infrastructure? And the usual came on. As an AI language model, I do not have access to current events or data. However, it told me it was possible that climate change could have played a role in the period from 2014 to 2021 in the Emfuleni area. And then I checked up on this. We find climate change in many parts of the world affecting societies, and it's no different in South Africa. Especially currently we are experiencing cyclones in Southeast Africa, along the coastal regions and in the inland parts. And South Africa's climate change in future will be hotter in the west and drier in the west and more unpredictable in the east, with patterns of cyclonal weather coming into the northeastern parts of South Africa.
Thank you.
Cyclones have an impact on water storage, and also I list the cyclones and the impact on South Africa and the Vaal, Upper Vaal region. So climate change, I would say, definitely is a factor affecting South Africa. That cyclone, Dineo,
Johann, I think we can leave it here, Johann. I think we've got plenty to chew on. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. I know you put a lot of work into the presentation. Right, I'm looking for hands. I already have, I think, Brett Bennett to start us off. Brett?
Thank you so much for that presentation and very interesting report. I've obviously known about your work before. I wrote a book on forest and water management in South Africa, but nothing like the Vaal complex and actual water management. So your work has been very informative and so detailed. So it's a real pleasure to have you here at UJ. I just wonder, would you say that the situation in the Vaal is globally unique in some ways or not? So because you have so much detail that proves all the points you're trying to make, but I'm just trying to wonder, like the history of infrastructure and the history of water infrastructure, or what we are seeing in South Africa, like at this instance, is this part of a pattern that's uniquely South African, or is it Southern African? Is there Zimbabwean or Mozambican or Zambian water infrastructure history that's similar to this? Because there's obviously big systems they've got, but maybe not the same as the Vaal. So I'm just wondering, is South Africa's water infrastructure more complex also than these neighboring countries? So what really, in a sense, a historical perspective, when we're looking regionally, when we're looking globally, and when we're looking at South Africa, I'm just trying to figure out, like, what does this tell us about the world and the region? And I know that it's so interesting, and you must have such a wealth of knowledge. This was not part of your paper per se, but I'd just love to hear if you have any thoughts on any of those elements. But thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. For a start, sub-Saharan Africa is at present the fastest growing region in the world for urbanized communities to start taking shape. So many of them are experiencing water problems. Water scarcity is a commonplace, and also wastewater infrastructure systems aren't functioning properly. But in the case of South Africa, we have comprehensive infrastructure systems that predate the current era, where you had a very sophisticated system in operation, not for all the country's residents, which was put excessively to the test, and this has had profound consequences for the current society. But historically, when we look at what happened in the past and how they're managing at present, I think it's a question of government and especially the water sector trying to catch up and trying to work consistently on a system, trying to resolve specific questions. And in that respect, I've recently worked on megacities and their emergence in the global south and the global north. And it's interesting to see how in the more innovative and more wealthy parts of the global south, you find that cities are beginning to improve and cope with issues of wastewater and water supply systems. That also comes along with support from partners in the international water sector who exchange ideas constantly, and there are discussions and deliberations constantly underway. So I think the South African situation at present is not exceptional. It is probably maybe in a slightly better condition than in many other parts of Africa, but there is always the potential for improvement on the way forward.
Do you want to come back, Brett?
No, that's perfect. I just wanted to hear your thoughts, and I think it's really interesting to think about as we have a decline of infrastructure around the world. There's declining infrastructure not just in South Africa. There's new infrastructure all over the world as well. But it's interesting seeing cycles of infrastructure in the sense that these things last for 100 or 200 or 50 years, and there's sort of anyway. I'm just thinking about this longer history of development and what the future means. But this is great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Brett, if I just can respond to this, if you speak to engineers, they will tell you, look, no infrastructure system has a heck of a long life. It always has to be maintained, and it always has to be upgraded and improved. So one example was 400 years of infrastructure development in Germany that was written by a German historian way back in the 2010s. And he pointed out that you have consistent breakdowns. So it's not something that's confined only to today's modern countries. It goes back to a very long time in history, and I'm sure even the Romans had infrastructure problems to manage, especially in water and wastewater systems.
Thank you, Johann. I'm looking for other people to raise their hands virtually. You can click on reaction and click raise hand, or indeed to draw my attention in the chat. Thank you. I see Nordia and Pfizer. Nordia? Nordia, I think you just need to unmute yourself, or we can't hear you at the moment. Perhaps, Nordia, you can paste your question in the chat for now. Shall we go with Pfizer first? Pfizer.
Hey, thanks very much, Johann. I thought your presentation and your paper was very interesting. I was particularly struck by the way that you present the political activity around this project, because when you say that there's been things are falling apart and there's been disaster, the thing that immediately comes to my mind, and I think the mind of many people in South Africa, is it's because of political corruption. And that is the picture we get from the media commonly. And yet you paint this, you're very sympathetic to the people who are involved in the government in these systems. And I wonder if you could be, and I suspect this comes from probably speaking to them and getting to terms of what they do and finding that they're actually very committed people in government to the care of this infrastructure. And I wonder if you could be a little bit more explicit about the way in which you see politics broadly conceived of as in the sphere of government and the activities of government officials, and the way you conceive of these in relation to these infrastructural systems and their maintenance. If it's not simply through this lens that we often get of corruption, which is destroying infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, there are many instances of, let's say, corruption in the system, without a doubt. And I have picked that up on several instances, especially in the wastewater treatment works of the Vaal. And also, it is not confined only to the government and its acolytes. I think it covers a more comprehensive grouping of people. But I also think that the forces of nature, such as, for example, drought conditions and floods, cause certain events to take place. And for that, you need to have people taking an active role, playing an active role at short notice to try and avert a severe crisis. And that presents itself on numerous occasions. And I'm not necessarily very favorably disposed to some of the former ministers of water and sanitation and even some of the officials. But as a rule, I do take note, and I engage a lot with officials at the Department of Water and Sanitation and also Rand Water, because I am familiar with their operations and what they've been doing for more than 130 years now in the Gauteng region. So you cannot, as a historian, when you write about water and infrastructure systems, not respect what was accomplished and the current situation, the political dynamics at play. It's a very dynamic field, because you have communities who have their political agendas, you have potential agents who have their agendas of securing contracts, and then you have the municipal people with specific agendas, as well as the residents who only want service delivery. So there are numerous role players, and you name it, you come across them within the system, where you have to deal with acid mine drainage, where you have to deal with water quality and deteriorating commercial opportunities for disposing of pre-used water.
Thank you, Johann. I think that was a very good question and a good answer. Nordia, if you don't mind, I'm going to read out your question since he was having a mic problem. Sorry about my mic. We are looking at a classic systemic crisis with multiple overlapping causes. We need multiple overlapping solutions. Any thoughts, Johann, on the history of activism, conservation, technology, and sustainability in this area? Thanks. I suppose it's another way of asking in some ways about what's the way forward, do you think?
Okay, I'm also active in the water forums of the Vaal River Barrage and the Vaal Dam, as well as the Upper Vaal River system. And I quarterly attend these meetings, and I engage with the officials and also large industries, local authorities, engaging with the authorities on their water quality and the problems they experience. So I think that what we essentially have is, yes, we have crises that present themselves at times of floods and droughts, as I stated before. So that is nature working, getting into play. And as a historian, yes, we look at it quantitatively, but we also have to realize that we need to start looking in very specific frameworks. For example, the water, energy, food nexus. How do they allow these systems to work, and how do they interact? What happens if one of those components fall out? Then you have systems collapse, as we recently had with Johannesburg's water supplies because of the load shedding. So it's a very fragile system. And also, I think what we need as historians to nurture and to cultivate is thinking about complex physical systems and complex adaptive systems and how they operate. So maybe it's a little removed from human role players, but ultimately, complexity implies an approach on the human side that requires a constant vigil and special care. And politically, I think the corruption that comes into water sector contracts and the like, it's throughout the system. It's a global phenomenon. I don't think you'll easily work out of that very clearly. So politically, I would say, if you are a researcher, a historian working in this field, the best is to look at the leading role players and what changes they have made and what progresses they have made. For example, I can just mention the Lesotho Highlands Water Project that now comes onto power in 2028. It's the second phase of the project. It's been running since 2012, that they could not find a conclusion and an agreement. And they probably, on the way forward, will also still experience problems. But it is being indigenized as a problem. And it's more a new generation of engineers and managers coming to the fore and taking charge of a typical African challenge in terms of water supply and sanitation services.
Thanks, Johann. I thought I'm looking for other hands. We still have about 10 minutes, so there is still time for other hands. I thought I'd insert myself here briefly, sort of to just kind of build on both Pfizer and Nordia's points, which I thought were both very good. You know, because it's striking that this framing of things fall apart does perhaps, while there's abundant evidence to support it, including, you know, I have experience in my part of Joburg of the problems that were caused by the recent sort of intersection of load shedding and water issues. And, you know, one can go on. It's striking that your paper does, as I think Pfizer correctly picked up, it's interspersed with statements that do refer, and even your oral presentation does refer to expertise and also refers to a lot kind of longer history and previous moments of crisis. So I suppose it's the classic problem, which is where do the crises begin and end, or you know, there's the risk of wiggishness obviously involved. But anyway, I think you've already in some ways addressed this, and I don't think it's a major problem in the paper. Just perhaps something to think about in terms of framing. And then I would reiterate again, at the risk of repeating what you've already said, Johann, this point about the fragility of infrastructural systems, because in a way, saying things are falling apart uniquely in a kind of unprecedented way now does presuppose stability, but in fact, collapse indicates precisely the fragility of these systems. So I think in a way Pfizer's right to say, and Nordia too, to point us towards the, you know, for instance, this corruption discourse, which is so prevalent in the public sphere, is so under-descriptive of what's actually going on. It's a big part of the problem. We know it is. But if you think of the Joburg water crisis recently, it was the wastewater plants on the Vaal that had repeated tripping, partly to do with load shedding, partly independent electrical problems, and on top of that, the fact that it was really hot. And the combination of those things caused a kind of particular crisis. So it's just striking how contingent actually some of these things are, which is not the same as giving corrupt politicians a pass. Anyway, any other hands? I see Amanda's posted something. Amanda, would you like to read your question out loud?
Thank you, Dr. Sparks. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to ask Prof whether or not he managed to look into other areas apart from the Vaal Triangle, because in Hammanskraal, where I work, people don't drink water from the taps because it is unclean, it's dirty. We have tanks in schools, we do have taps, but we actually buy water for the learners to drink because the water is unclean. So my question would be, do we blame climate change for that, or do we also have to admit that the ANC government has partly failed? In the East Rand, where I'm from, Tsakane to be precise, since last year, they've been having water outages for not 3 days, for weeks, could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks. They don't have water and it comes back for 4 hours or 2 hours, and then it goes back, goes away again. So I think, I don't know, maybe I need assistance with that aspect. Thank you.
Before you answer, Johann, I missed Julie Powell's question. Julie, is it okay if I read it? Or would you like to say it out loud?
Yes, please, Stephen.
Sure. So it's a question about if Johann, you could comment on the nature of your sources. Were there any that you were not allowed access to? What, and secondly, what, if any, are the gendered aspects of the water pollution, especially for women who very probably are mostly responsible for direct water collection, especially in disadvantaged informal dwellings? So Johann, I suspect it might be helpful if you try to pull Amanda and Julie's questions together for us as we close.
Okay, right, Amanda, thank you for your question. Since the late 1990s, QD our research niche for the cultural dynamics of water, we worked on the Vaal River barrage, but extensively in the rural municipalities and local areas, even non-municipal areas in Northwest Province, as well as the Northern Free State. And we did transdisciplinary research projects with people of all races. And we know what it is like when communities sit without water for extensive periods of time. I'm familiar with Tshwane's problems as well as those of Hammanskraal, because I've been working with people at the TUT in terms of guidance for their postgraduate students. So yeah, we also have that, but in the case of Emfuleni, you just need to go to Sebokeng to see similar problems that you mention here. In what is to be, let's say, peri-urban areas of settlement, informal settlements and the like. Now, as far as, can you please just let Amanda, can she just, or the lady ask the questions that you conveyed to me?
I think it's, are you talking about Julie's questions?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so Julie just asked if there are any sources you had difficulty accessing, and secondly, about the gendered aspects of the effects of the water pollution.
Okay, I have sat many hours in the offices or the reception areas of municipal managers not wanting to speak to me or give us access to any of their municipal documentation. So what we've done is, under many circumstances, we had officials helping us with information and giving us some of their documentation. and most of it was collected by means of oral interviews and focus group discussions with communities. And ultimately, those were the comments that mattered most, because you got the message directly from the dysfunctional water tap or the dysfunctional wastewater treatment system in a township or in a fashionable suburb of an urban area. But the local authorities, as a rule, from my experience in the 2000 and early 2010s, they were not forthcoming. And usually it was from local communities that most of the valuable information was received.
And do you want to talk about the gendered aspects of the water pollution, specifically that in all likelihood,
Yes.
the labor of fetching drinkable water is
Yeah,
often performed by women?
it is very evident that women are the best managers of water, and strategies aimed at ensuring a better dispensation for women as the managers of the domestic system and in charge of the water supply it's very important. It's vitally important. And there comes a point in time when you realize that the issue of the woman's voice is crucial, because in the case of Parys, for example, in the township, on one occasion in 2006, we spoke to it was 11 ladies, and we asked them, how much would you be prepared to pay a month if you had a constant supply of water? And the answer was 7 rands. And when we worked out how that 7 rands figured from the discussions we had, it transpired that 3 rands paid for the taxi to Parys and back to the township, and then the 4 rands was for the 5 liters of water that they could get at the local spa. So women, I think, are the cornerstone, especially in terms of conveying environmental health messages when it comes to dealing with water as the responsible managers of the system, and we respect them at all times.
It's a heavy burden to carry. So I think we're really running out of time, but I do want to point out that there were some excellent additional comments in the chat, which I will send Johann's way, including a number of people, I think, really reinforcing Amanda's point, which is a kind of anger, which I think a lot of us are feeling, that while the context of climate change, of course, is an important one, much of what you're describing and many of us are experiencing to varying degrees, but in it seems increasing universality, are human-made disasters or human-made problems. And Mark, one of our PhD students, points out that there is actually a literature in the science and technology studies field, which has been emphasizing that as technological systems become more complicated, that they also increase in their sort of instability and the likelihood that they might fail. The work of Charles Perrault in particular is useful for this. But I will send those to you, Johann. I want to thank you for your presentation and paper, and everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us. We don't do we do everything in person these days, except for this seminar. And I'd like to think that that's something good, that we get to be part of a wider community every now and then. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next month when we do this again. Thank you. Thanks, Johann. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.